forgiving others. And our monthly topic is forgiven and forgiving, and our meta topic is the Spirit. And that meditative moment is absolutely critical to all of those. I want to take back something that I said last week, though. I said that forgiving others was easier than seeking forgiveness. But on reflection, I want to entirely reverse that statement. And maybe it's because it suits this week's sermon, and last week it suited that sermon. But when we cause harm to someone we care about, it's instinctive to seek forgiveness. We do not like that feeling. It's a good thing. So that's instinctive, to seek forgiveness. It hurts knowing we have hurt a loved one. But when we have been hurt, it is equally instinctive to hurt back. In that way, seeking forgiveness is quite in line with our reactive habits. Seeking forgiveness is a natural reaction, generally a good one. Granting forgiveness is just the opposite. So it's worth recalling at this moment that as we've been reflecting on the last couple of weeks, forgiveness has primarily to do with you. With me. Not the person you are forgiving. Not the person forgiving you. It has everything to do with what is going on with you. The primary action happens here, in your heart. Now, after last week's sermon, I had another invigorating conversation with one of our worship associates, John Clark. And John has done a lot of thinking about forgiveness. I could only imagine why. And now I'll be doing some more thinking about forgiveness after service. At any rate, John pointed out a way to further clarify the action of forgiveness by noticing how it is often incorrectly identified. He pointed out that forgiveness is often mistaken for reconciliation, when in fact these two are distinct operations. So for John, forgiveness is a cooling or a total release of emotional energy regarding what was once an offense that engaged some heated emotions. So I'm paraphrasing here. John will let me know, I'm sure, if I miss the mark. But when you are no longer emotionally hooked or ruffled or tugged at by some event or person, you have forgiven them. Thereby is paved the road to reconciliation. And now parties estranged by conflict or hurt can resume harmonious and productive relations. I think that's a very clarifying way to look at forgiveness, to discern, in fact, what it is not. However, sometimes it's true that we reconcile without really actually forgiving. And this is a bit of the cart before the horse. It's not always bad. Sometimes it pays to fake it until you make it. But more likely the issue has been buried deep, not burned away. And it will then emerge as a weapon or trigger in some reactive rampage to stimulus in the future. So faking it till you make it, reconciling without truly forgiving, is not the path of a spiritual seeker, ethical explorer, or anyone who knows that transformation is not a one-time permanent fix. Spiritual seekers, ethical explorers, and transformers know that staying on the path, the spiritual path, takes work and courage. The spiritual path is not an escalator that you just can step on. You get one whopping spiritual insight and then sit back and enjoy the ride to nirvana. In fact, spiritual insight reveals how much work is needed to stay on the path. Not to get on the path, but to stay on the path. Luckily, spiritual insight also keeps you near the path with the coincidental insight into how rewarding the path can be. Now, the practice of forgiveness is a spiritual practice and exemplifies what I have just described. The reward for staying on this path, the reward for integrity in forgiveness, the reward for dissolving the hook before declaring the peace is non-reactivity, ease, and ultimately freedom. And sometimes the price of freedom is just time. Time gives, and in the end is, perspective. And sometimes we are afforded that luxury. Sometimes time is all it takes to have the emotions cool off and have the hook evaporate on its own. But it is more usually the case that we are not afforded that luxury, that we find ourselves forgiving those with whom we are around the most. And so there's not much time before we are around them again. More often than not, freedom takes not time that we do not have, but rather simple work. That is to say, forgiveness takes work. It is the work of opening up. It is work to let go. And I've already told you about how in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus acknowledges that the afflicted he meets are forgiven. It's not that it was Jesus who forgave, who had the power to forgive, but it was Jesus who had the insight to recognize the inherent forgiveness of the afflicted, of everyone. Their inherent worth and dignity, you might say. And the phrase the Nazarene used to convey this truth was affiente. Which means you are let go of. So forgiveness is akin to letting go. And this actually sounds quite similar to John's understanding. Occurs to me now that John may have more in common with Jesus than we ever knew. Forgiving is letting go of emotional reactivity. That is the state of the divine. It is a spiritual state, a state where we are all inherently imbued with the possibility and promise of letting go if we are willing to do the work. But how is letting go work? I mean, it sounds very easy. It seems like it should be the easiest thing in the world, but it's not so. And this is because anger generates a lot of power and a lot of attraction, maybe even a lot of habit. It calcifies forms. And a fun exercise to do is to hold up your thumb or another offensive digit. This is the offensive digit. Hold it up. Everyone, I need you to do this exercise with me. With one hand, take your other hand. Jane's like sizing me up. She's got to do this. With your other hand, squeeze. You're mad at this finger, and you're going to squeeze hard. Squeeze it as hard as you can. We're just going to keep squeezing for a while. I should have written some dialogue to go underneath this, but I didn't. So we're just going to keep squeezing it as hard as you can. Really put strength in your fingers, right? That's reactivity. That's anger. You cannot right or drive or play piano or very easily find the next page. When you're angry, right? Okay, so now do not release it. Just enough to withdraw your thumb. Just let your thumb go. That's the impulse to freedom. The anger might be gone. Now, but you're kind of like, this doesn't naturally open all by itself, does it? You have to intentionally open your hand. You have to do some work to open your hand. And now you could play piano and turn the page and drive. Return to responsibility, return control to yourself. That is how forgiveness happens. And this is what forgiveness yields. So last week we reflected on the transformative power of seeking forgiveness. I propose that in seeking forgiveness, we must first come face to face with our flaws, our sins, our imperfections, our hamartia, our missing the mark. I suggested that by comprehending our imperfections, not excusing them, but by comprehending them and those of others, that we deliver ourselves out of reactivity and into the opportunity for responsibility, and in that responsibility does our freedom have a chance to manifest. This same dynamic is true, of course, of forgiving somebody else or something else. So here's kind of a neat trick. Let's say you get in a fight with somebody, or somebody harms you in some way, and you, being the attentive Unitarian Universalist of integrity that you are, apologize in the first case, and also in either case, you inform them that you have forgiven them. You know it's the right thing to do. You don't want to be like this. You think you've done the work, you forgive them. And in the pardon, you say something like this. I mean, how many people have said something like this, right? I forgive you, but do you think that you can apologize to me? Right? Okay, so that's actually not a trick, it's a test. And you failed. Now, if you are in need of an apology, you have not let go of the emotional hook. You have, in fact, not forgiven them. You have not comprehended their inherent humanness, inherent imperfection, or your own. And you have not used that comprehension as a tool to pry the emotional dagger out of your side. You are not free of reactivity. You are not freed into responsibility. You are not free. Worse yet, you have made your freedom contingent not on your own heart and work, but on the actions of somebody else. You are now captive not only to your own reactivity, but to another's reactivity. So this is no bueno. It is useful. It is a test, and a test is a tool, and this one lets you understand your own reactivity that much better. It also reveals something that we've already considered. Forgiveness is not about what someone else did or how someone else feels, whether they feel sorry or not. Forgiveness is about how you feel. Have you let go? Have your emotions cooled? Have you removed the dagger? So here's another scenario. someone eats the last cookie, which was by rights yours. Everyone knows it. They apologize and appear truly sorry. You forgive them, or you say you do, knowing that it won't do any good to hold a grudge, and yet it still rankles. And later, when they say or do something that by most accounts would be innocuous and on most occasions would be harmless, it feels like a hammer on that dagger, and you lash out in anger. And sometimes this actually can happen and get a big argument going because you thought that you should have got that cookie. I mean, this, I testify anyway. This has happened to me. I like cookies. But you hadn't, in fact, you have not forgiven. You've done just the opposite. In fact, you put spurs to the cycle of reactive habit. You've not done the work of forgiveness, despite the understanding that its reward is as sweet as honey. And maybe you didn't do the work because you didn't know there was work to do before hearing this reflection. Now you don't have an excuse. And I'm sort of embarrassed to admit that it was a revelation to me as I wrote this reflection. The work of forgiveness. So then the question becomes one of method. How are we to remove this dagger? How are we to cool out? How are we to let go? How are we to find ourselves in a state of forgiveness? And here, I think it helps to consider origins and conclusions. So to find the end that is forgiveness, we want to find the root of forgiveness. To find the work of forgiveness, we want to find the root of reactivity. The root of forgiveness is all those feelings, all those things, all of those dispositions. The root of forgiveness is all of those dispositions that have nothing to do with fear. Fear calls us into reactivity. Now, as I say that, it occurs to me that some things actually should always be feared. So we must bring our grown-up powers of discernment to bear, to discover which fear keeps us alive. These are fairly obvious. And which fear is less obviously, but truthfully, death by degrees. This leads to another uncomfortable truth. I think it is probably the case that there are some things beyond our power to forgive. Some things are unforgivable because our hearts will never be free of their pain. This is not a recommendation. It's an observation. And it is unfortunate. I have a high school acquaintance who is now a Facebook friend, and this week she posted on Facebook that it was the 1-year anniversary of the car wreck that killed her brother and sister-in-law. They had 3 kids, and they were killed by a 16-year-old high on meth, driving a stolen car over 100 miles per hour. How does that pain ever cool? But even here, and maybe especially in tragedies like this, there is some understanding to be gained from this safe remove. Life is precarious. And while it is absolutely necessary, love itself is dangerous. Indeed, all love ends painfully. That's a guarantee. Death or circumstance or change happens. There's no way around it. It occurs to me that all those apocalyptic texts and tales are so seductive to us because they speak to this inherent truth in our condition, the truth that we live in the shadow of a personal Armageddon at every moment and always have from the first conscious hominid until now. The understanding of guaranteed loss is the thorn in our paw that is intractable. I'm not just talking about fear of death. There are things that are more frightening. The fear of losing love, or the fear of not being worthy of love, of inadequacy, can be more frightening and unacceptable than death. And yet it is a fear that is bound to come true. We will lose love. But in the face of that certainty, we have a choice. How do you want to live? You could ignore this thorn in your paw and everyone else's paw and walk around irritable and reactive. Or you can comprehend that we all have this thorn, this inborn fear of losing the love we have or not being worthy of the love we need. That comprehension is the root of compassion and forgiveness. It's the root of reactivity. And it's the root of freedom. Why was he on meth? What circumstances led him to want to steal a car? What thrill was he seeking? What hole was he filling? What love was he replacing? Why was he not free? These questions do not excuse the boy, but they shift our perspective even a little. And in doing that, perhaps we are offered some relief from our fears come true. And if some things are too hard to be forgiven, if some acts will never allow our emotions to move on, then with perspective, with time, and with the comprehension that everyone you see and everyone that sees you is made visible only through the veil of the fear of losing the love we have or not being worthy of the love we need, by seeing that, we may draw nearer to some kind of peace. We may hope that after all, after a lot of work, freedom may be found. And even then, it's only secured in the moment and never forever. Yet it is our best hope. It is good. Sometimes it's nirvana, and it's okay that sometimes it is just enough.